out of this love relationship that they have. And again, you have to remember, at the time that Paul wrote this, women and men did not get together because they loved one another. They were in arranged marriages. You learned to love each other in this kind of manner. That's what differentiated Christian marriage from pagan marriage. That's what made the difference, is because the Christians loved each other. That's what made the difference. See, in our modern day, we think of dating and marriage and courting and stuff. That was not the case in the first century. That was not the case in the first century. Whether you were a king or a peasant, people got arranged marriages. It still happens in many parts of the world. Okay? The idea of dating and courting and marrying out of love is a Western idea that really develops out of the Romance period of the Middle Ages. I'm thinking like 12th century it begins, and it really doesn't come into fruition until after the French and American revolutions, I would say. Now, some would argue it happens before then, but I would say it really doesn't begin until after the Enlightenment. This whole idea of courting and dating and so forth as a means of marriage. Okay? So when Paul is writing this, it's really new ideas for a first century mindset. So, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This is the injunction on men in terms of their relationship to their wives. They are to love them in the same way that Christ loved the church. Now, how much did Christ love the church? How far did he go? To death. He laid down his life for the church. That's what men need to do in their relationship of love to their wives. That's the extent to which it goes. And I would argue this is implying what Adam should have done when he saw Eve being seduced by the serpent. He should have stepped right in between that, even if the snake bit him. If he died because of that, that was a small price to pay to love his wife, to prevent her from being further deceived and of disobeying God. That's what Adam should have done in loving his wife. Did he do that? No. His inaction is what precipitated or co-aided the fall. So when it says here, husbands, love your wives just like Christ loved the church and laid down his life for it, that's what he's again teaching men to do. Because Adam didn't. But Christ did. So he said, you want to know the example? Look at Christ. How did he love? Got it, men? That's how you are to love your wives. You give up your life for her. And out of that, wives are in subjection to the headship and leadership and guidance and protection that men afford as a response to that. Does that make sense? Okay? That's what we're talking about here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved you, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. It's by giving up our lives for our wives that we sanctify our wives in a very real sense, like Christ gives up his life to sanctify his church. How does he give up his life? Well, not only on the cross, but he perpetually gives it to us in the form of the sacraments. That's how the power of the cross affects us nowadays. The sacraments are the vessels by which we receive the grace that God has won for us from the cross to us. That's how he redeems us. That's how he sanctifies us. That's how he cleanses us to make us his perfect bride. Do you understand that? Following me? So it's through the sacraments that we get that grace. And here's the rest of that. I want to move on to Colossians 3. Okay. And again, this is a very succinct summary of what he said in Ephesians. It's just 2 verses. Wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So there is that subjectivity of women to men's headship in the household. What is the men's duty? Look again. Husbands, what? Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So this is kind of a negative commandment as opposed to Ephesians, which is a positive one. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. Now he's saying, love your wives and don't be harsh. Again, it's a call to be like Jesus is to us. That's how husbands should be to their wives. Get it? And what is this teaching men? To guard, protect, and love. Well, everything Adam did not do in the garden. And then finally, 1 Peter 3:7. We're going to come back to these verses when we talk about wives because they are interconnected. But this particular verse says, likewise, you husbands, live considerately with your wives, bestowing honor on the woman as the weaker sex, since you are joint heirs of the grace of life, in order that your prayers may not be hindered. I always find this a very interesting verse. It says, husbands, live considerably with your wives, bestowing honor on them, so that your prayers may not be hindered. It is implied here that if men aren't living their relationship properly with their wives, it's possible God won't hear their prayers because they're not living the full life of grace that they should. That says something about how God expects men to be the loving guardians and protectors of the relationship. Now, what about this woman as the weaker sex? I think we need to put this in its proper understanding. It's not saying women are weak. It's just saying in terms of physicality. Again, men are the guardians and protectors of the household. Women are not. Typically, they are not. Physically, or in the case of the first century, politically, able to lead and guide the household. Women had no rights in the first century. Women had no rights. There was no social security. There was no social services. Women depended on their men, whether it was their husbands or their fathers, to care for them because they had no one else to go to. What the Christian injunctions are saying here is that we need to show how God loves the church in the way that husbands treat their wives. Okay? Is everyone following me on this? So again, not to get all bent out of shape about, what do you mean I'm weak? What do you mean? What do you mean? You have to understand the context in which Peter and Paul are writing, and understanding that they're saying this in terms of general, physical, as well as political grounds. They just did not have the rights that men had in the first century. This was a big deal. This is why Christ took the time on the cross to take care of Mary at the cross, because he was dying, he was going to be dead. Who was going to take care of her? Joseph apparently was gone. She had no other children. Who was going to take care of her? St. John. Jesus put John as the person to take care of her after he was gone. That was very important because, again, there were no social services. She wasn't going to collect Social Security after Jesus was dead. She was a widow and with no male heirs to take care of her. She was on her own. That was very scary. So Jesus took the time to take care of her at the foot of the cross by making sure that someone had guardianship over her. And that was the disciple whom he loved. Yes?
Yeah. In the first century, like you said, women were put under the law that not allowed to do a lot of things.
Yes.
And have to obey mainly husband.
Yes.
But if you look closely in Luke Gospel, Luke 8, Jesus allowed women to do a lot of things, and allow me to read this verse. After this is Luke 8. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirit and disease, that called Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out.
Yes.
Okay? Joanna, the wife of Uzzah, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. The women were helping to support them out of their own means. So Jesus traveled, he doesn't travel alone. He traveled with a group.
Yeah.
And who paid the bill? We heard about, oh, you stay in this house, tax collector, come out. But actually, Jesus had to eat, live in a hotel.
Yes.
Who paid the bill? That's why he allowed this woman, the Joanna, the wife of Uzzah. And Uzzah, who is Uzzah? Uzzah is like the staff, president, chief of staff. He managed Herod, the king, property, and a lot of things like his property, his...
It was like a custodian.
Yeah. Like also his accountant.
Yes.
And a lot, and that brings him a lot of wealth too. So he's rich. And this lady right here, Susanna, instead of she's an elite, instead of she can live in the castle in the palace with a nice clothes, she chose to follow Jesus.
Yes.
And follow Jesus, listen to him preaching, and eating with a bunch of teenagers. Peter, all these here teenagers at the time. I mean, a fisherman. And then live with who was that? Mary Magdalene. I mean, the one that Jesus said to her. So she chose the life as a symbol instead of living in a palace. And where that Jesus got the money from her.
And I'm sure that there were a lot of people that supported Jesus' ministry.
Yeah, but she's the main one that helped him because he had a lot of money from her husband, Uzzah. And Uzzah is the household keeper of the King Herod.
Well, I think it's very possible that that's where at least some of Jesus's financing came from. I think it's also important to realize that Peter and Andrew, for example, were not teenagers. These were well-established men. They had their own fishing business. They had their own company that they ran. They were both married. We know Peter was married because Jesus cures his mother-in-law. So these were well-established businessmen. Matthew was a tax collector, so he was quite well off in his own way. Most of the apostles were established in some sort of business. They weren't poor by any means. So I'm sure out of their own means that they helped finance all of what Jesus was doing. And I'm sure many of the women that followed them had some means of their own that they contributed to Jesus's ministry as well. So we know that Jesus had a treasurer. Judas was the treasurer of the group. And how do we know that? Well, because the Gospel of John said they used to steal a little from the till. So he had a finance department to help him through that. But he had no property of his own. He relied on other people. You know, he used to say, what did he say? Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but
the Son of Man
has no place to lie his head. He owned no property. So he would go from different towns and villages and stay in different people's homes. We know at the end of his life, he stayed at Mary and Martha's a lot. In fact, all of Passion Week, he would go into Jerusalem, preach and teach, and then go into Bethany for the night. That's where Mary and Martha were. And back and forth. And he did this all during Passion Week. So that's how Jesus was able to operate while he was here on the earth. And it was all arranged by the Father. The Father took care of everything for that. So some women in the first century did have some powers. We're going to see some of that in the book of Acts. But for the most part, women had no political power, no rights as we understand them. Particularly in Israel, women couldn't, for example, testify in court of any kind. They were just not considered reliable witnesses, period. That was just how it was. And it's very interesting that when Jesus comes, he changes all of that. Why? Who's the first person to report on the resurrection?
Mary.
Mary Magdalene. She goes and tells the apostles. She's the apostle to the apostles, if you will. So again, God changes the whole thing. You know, the culture says women testimony doesn't mean anything. And what's the first thing that the resurrection tells us? It's told by women. The women go to the tomb. The women report. The women say all of this. So if you were writing this stuff to try and impress men, you wouldn't have women doing anything like that in here. That's just bad press. That's just